Plenty of things to talk about with our next guest. He is Sportsnet hockey insider Chris Johnston. CJ, it is nice to see Toronto has not burned down, sir. How are you today?
Yeah, I think there's relative peace in the streets. You know, I did a TV hit though in Maple Leaf Square this week after the Leafs lost, and there was some graffiti on the Legends Row statue they have honoring some of their former players. And so, you know, that's just one little thing. I don't know what was behind that, but the point is there is real unrest, and it's not just on Twitter. It's actually manifesting itself in the streets here.
Yeah, and a fan base that tends to get a little bit frustrated, and this does kind of seem to be a breaking point for a number of people. We'll get into some of the specifics of what that might mean a little bit later on here, but just going back to the series, now that we've had a couple of days to digest it, I said before, Toronto losing the series wasn't a factor in my mind until there was about 10 minutes left in the third period of Game 7. Like that didn't cross my mind. So I guess the first one, what the hell happened?
Man, I don't really have a good answer for that question. You know, it occurred to me a little sooner than it did for you. Like when I was in the building for Game 7 and watched the way they came out in the first period, that was the first time I was like, oh, wow. Like, because I expected them to just come take control of that game, score early, get a lead, be difficult to play against. But really until that point in the series, I didn't think they were going to lose either. Even the way things went down and where they let the 3-1 lead get to a Game 7, I just thought in that moment that they would, that their elite talent would win out, because, that's one thing Montreal couldn't, that's one area where Montreal really couldn't match them. And then, so you take a step back, you look at it, the Leafs scored 4 more goals than the Habs in the series in total. They had more shot attempts, more high danger chances, more scoring chances. Their goaltender, Jack Campbell, had a better save percentage than Carey Price in the series. It's hard to really identify much other than Toronto played its worst game in Game 7, and Montreal got better as things went along. I think the Canadiens, got their younger players in the lineup midway through the series, and then by Games 5 and 6, they started to see the benefit of that. They get a couple wins, and we've seen them now go win Game 1 in Winnipeg in the second round. I mean, I think the Canadiens kind of got it together, and the Leafs were, falling apart, running out of energy. I don't have a good explanation. I think one thing we all wonder about is this a mental block for some of the elite players on this team, given that they've now, failed to win a playoff series in 5 straight postseasons. Maybe it was that, but I think that's the reason the reaction has been the players were so upset. I mean, guys are crying on Zoom after, and the reason management seems so perplexed, and I can't give you a good answer, is because everyone was sideswiped by this.
Yeah. Well, and it's just they've checked off every box that they were supposed to in this time. It's all right. You have the elite talent, check. The veterans in the room who are supposed to guide you through this with Simmons and Spezza and Joe Thornton, check. The goaltending was not an issue, check. Like I don't. Apparently, analytics was the issue according to some, which it wasn't. But like I'm happy that you're as perplexed as I am, because I look at this and it's okay. How do you fix the Maple Leafs now? It's like I don't have a damn clue, because everything here is what it's kind of supposed to look like.
Right. And I guess in this specific series, it's true. Austin Matthews and Mitch Marner didn't produce enough. I think ultimately that's why they're not still playing games in the second round. But I don't really have a lot of long-term doubts about those players. They played 7 games in 12 days. And, Matthews hit a couple posts and had by far the most number of shots in the series. He's literally scored like 0.55 goals per game since he entered the NHL. If you give him 34 shots in the next series he plays, I like the odds of us talking about him being a superstar in that series. And so,
right.
And it's not to say it's all bad bounces, because I think there is more to it than that. I think Montreal limited the way that line, did its business, and didn't give up shots from really the home plate area too much in front of Carey Price. I'm not really trying to take anything away from Montreal, but I think, ultimately, if you look at it, the Leafs were built to have those guys win them playoff rounds. Tampa won a Stanley Cup last year with 1 line scoring and Victor Hedman scoring. Like, if you look at their second, third, and fourth line, they got almost nothing. The Leafs in this series got 6 points in 7 games from Alex Kerfoot, who started on their third line. They got 5 points from Jason Spezza. They got 2 goals from Jake Muzzin. They got what we might term the depth scoring enough to get through, had the guys at the top of the lineup been as productive as you're used to. And so I think that they deserve to wear some blame for this. But that's why I don't want to go too far overboard, because I do believe if you put them in another playoff series, they're probably going to be as great as they've been really for 5 years as NHL players.
Now, before we get too far into the Toronto aspect of this, despite what some people may think of the hockey media in this country, we are aware there were two teams out there with Montreal deserving a lot of the credit, as you've mentioned. But they go out, they win game one against the Winnipeg Jets. What have you seen from Montreal here in this comeback and then in game one against Winnipeg that's kind of turned things around a little bit?
Well, I sort of see this as Marc Bergevin's plan, getting a stamp of approval a little bit. This was something he's been consistent about. Obviously, he's got some older players on his roster. The way they made moves in the offseason, they added some big defensemen. They were built, quote unquote, for the playoffs, for the way the games are a little bit different. And while I get why that gets mocked, because let's face it, if this was an 82-game season, I'm not sure Montreal gets in the way things were trending. If there was more push from teams like Calgary or Vancouver, even Ottawa. I mean, Ottawa came on in the late part of the year. They didn't get into the playoffs by a lot, but once they've got there, they do seem better equipped to handle it. I mean, they were very difficult on the Leafs' top players physically. I think that there's a price to be paid for the offense, and maybe that's one of the reasons by the end of the series against Toronto that it wasn't happening as much as just, you're going up against Shea Weber, Joel Edmondson, Ben Sherratt. Those are tough minutes, especially when you add them up night after night after night. And, it's worked. They managed to squeeze some offense out here. And I don't really get why they didn't start this series with Cole Caulfield and Jesperi Kotkaniemi playing, because what you've seen is, that infusion of youth has helped them. And those guys have been productive players for them in this playoffs. But, I see a team with a great goaltender that's kind of built to make life hard on you. And they're just grinding out win after win after win right now.
Did that win save Marc Bergevin? Not the game one win, the Toronto one. Did that save Marc Bergevin's job? Because there was a lot put into this season, and then it seemed like a panic firing of a head coach midway through the year. It kind of felt like he understood that this season needed to go very well for him. Did that win kind of save his job?
Well, what it did, I think, is validate his program. And, that's important here, because my view of this situation is that it wasn't a slam dunk. Marc Bergevin himself wanted to be back with the Montreal Canadiens. He's got 1 year left on his contract. There have been some discussions with Jeff Molson, the owner of the Canadiens, about what the future looks like for Marc. And, it did feel like late in the regular season, they were kind of in a bit of a no man's land there. And I do think one of the options on the table was maybe, parting ways, mutually almost. That seems harder to imagine now, especially if they're able to get through the series of Winnipeg. You get to the third round, even no matter what happens there, it would be very rare or unusual to see a GM or his owner split up after achieving that kind of success. And so, it's maybe we're still in the moment so much, it's hard to give a really firm answer about where this is headed. But I will say that the principles on which the team were built have kind of been justified in the playoffs. Now they're having some success in the playoffs. I think those conversations with the owner about his future are going to look a little different when this playoff run ends than they were, say in April or so.
So now back to the Toronto aspect of this, because there's obviously a lot to dive into with this. Everyone's going to want a big move. Like you said, that this is 5 years. This is a bunch of attempts, and it's always ended the same with this core group of players. Do you think we see a big move from the Toronto Maple Leafs this offseason?
This is more gut than information. I think there's going to be something. Okay. If you watch what Brendan Shanahan and Kyle Dubas said in their locker cleanout day, they made it sound very clear, like, we're just running it back. We believe in this group. We're going to do it again. And I think a lot of that is just managing the moment and trying to get through that experience. I never learned too much in those days. It's not an insult to those people. It's just, I think there's only so much you can say in that position. The feeling of the loss is still fresh. I'm not sure it's a big move like trading Mitch Marner. That's not what I'm saying. But I'd be surprised if it was true status quo, where you sort of deal with a couple of the UFAs lower down the roster. You add a few players, like kind of window dressing almost. I think they got some hard decisions this summer. I mean, Zach Hyman, not necessarily a huge name, but he's been a part of the core of this team, going back to even a season in the American Hockey League. He's a UFA. So I think whatever decision they make there will have a feeling in the dressing room, will have impact. Morgan Riley's entering the final year of his contract. He's a heart and soul guy on the team. He wears a letter, universally beloved, just a great guy, and certainly, no issues there. And he actually played really well in the playoffs, I thought. But, if they're not extending him, maybe they look at moving him. Like, I think they almost have to do something to shock the system. And so, yeah, we're not necessarily talking about absolute NHL blockbuster, but I would be surprised if they don't do something that gets everyone's attention on the team and just reinforces the urgency here. I mean, we're at the point where talk about the Leafs doesn't even matter. What they say almost doesn't matter. Like
Right.
that, it's awful, but like, I think that's one thing that they're understanding is their fans are angry because they just want to see some success in the playoffs. And I don't think there'll be that much excitement no matter who they sign, no matter who they bring in, no matter what they say. We've got it right this time. We have that mix. I think it's about doing it. And, once the dust settles here, I think Kyle Dubas will ultimately decide he's got to change something to really get that dressing room's attention.
Yeah, the Leafs could go 82-0 in the regular season next year, and no one in Toronto, I mean, some people in Toronto would bat an eye, but no one in Toronto would be planning parades or anything just based on like that. This was supposed to be the year, right? There's no Boston, there's no Tampa Bay. Just get through Montreal and either Edmonton or Winnipeg, and hey, look at that, you're in the semifinals. Like this kind of felt like the best shot, and I think that probably adds to some of the frustration as well.
Yeah, you'll never get one like this. Like you played every team in Canada either 9 or 10 times, and they were decidedly better over each of those series. Obviously, there's bad games along the way, but they proved they were better than each of those teams in the regular season. And then you look at a playoff format where you're right, you only got to go through 2 of them, and you're in the third round. And to drop and then to build the lead against Montreal. I mean, that's why the outcry is what it is.
Yeah,
because I do think the expectations this year were finally justified. This wasn't just, hey, they have elite players that are winning individual awards. It was, they demonstrated as a team, they got way better defensively. Like they didn't give up near the number of chances. Their underlying numbers were stronger. The goals against were stronger. They were a more complete team this year. This is without doubt the best Leafs team, which again is a low bar for the last 20 years anyway. And so, I think any excitement or hype around them was real, but everyone kind of, you put your hand on the stove and you got burned there. And so, they could go have a similar regular season next year, even against teams like Tampa and Boston, Florida in that division, Montreal. And I don't think people will buy into the same level until they see it proven come next spring.
What about in goal for Toronto? Like Frederik Andersen was an elite goalie until he wasn't. And now it seems like there are some question marks in net. Well, where do you think the Leafs go between the pipes?
Well, they feel really good about Jack Campbell. He signed next season for $1.65 million, which is a bargain if he can play even just half the games at anywhere near the level he had this season. In the .920 save percentage wise, was very good in the playoffs. I know there was a tough goal on him in Game 7, but he didn't let in 4 tough goals in Game 7. Like a team built like the Leafs should be able to overcome one mistake in a big game. And so, having him sign, I think, is a huge positive. It'll be interesting to see where they go next. I mean, it's clear to me they're going to go more platoon type of situation. I don't think they're bringing in a $5 million partner for him. And I actually believe Frederik Andersen is a possibility for them. I think that he's a good fit for them at the right price point. If he's coming back, making $1.5 million or $2 million, something that makes the overall tandem being paid less. And I'm not sure if Frederik wants to do that, but I do believe all things being equal, he'd like to remain in Toronto. A healthy season where he's not expected to be the number one could be the fit. If it's not him, there are a number of goaltenders that are UFA that won't blow your socks off by names, but I'm looking at like Antti Ranta. There's guys out there that I think if you're trying to play them somewhere between 25 to 40 games, you feel comfortable with. And I am, certain the Leafs will go cheaper with this option because they need more financial flexibility to bolster their team in other areas. They were paying Frederik $5 million the last 5 years. I think they want to keep the number total for their 2 goaltenders next season below that.
Any pressure? I mean, there's always pressure. It's Toronto, but for Dubas and Keefe, like, is the seat under them getting hot at all, or are they pretty set where they're at?
Yeah, I'd say both of them. They're tied together, for obvious reasons. They work together in, 2 other places before this, Sault Ste. Marie and in the American Hockey League. And, he was the handpicked successor to Mike Babcock with Sheldon Keefe. So, I think for Kyle Dubas, he needs results to go. I think if you look at what he's done, it's really hard to be that critical. I mean,
Right.
Yes, they just lost the first round of playoffs, but the way they managed the cap, the team he built this year, their performance over the regular season, I mean, there's a lot there if you're his boss to say, like, this is the right guy for the job. But he's going to reach a point at some point in the future where he needs results to go with the good feelings that come with, the work he's doing. So, I would say the seat will be rather warm all of next season. What would be interesting if we're going to game theory it out is, if they play a third of the season and they have a rough start and they're not in playoff position, I don't know how everyone reacts then. But I would say these guys only have one more guaranteed year. So, a lot depends on what happens in the next season and in the next calendar year in terms of preserving their jobs.
Just from a personal standpoint, you are an NHL insider, but covering the Canadian team with the Toronto Maple Leafs, the one that gets the most coverage. And then going into the playoffs, there's a certain expectation when you're reporting just on the playoffs or focusing on that. But for you, there's also the NHL insidery stuff that I can't even begin to imagine what all goes into that. Is it tough to balance, like, hey, I need to pay attention to the rest of the league, but also I'm covering kind of one of the biggest teams in the league here for a playoff run? Is that a tough balance for you personally?
Yeah, it's like my forever, it's like the part of my job I feel I'm never getting quite right, like finding that balance. And I think everyone in your life, you can identify with that, whether it's between your home and work duties, with your family and all that stuff. It's hard to really feel like you're putting the right energy into each different pot, if you will. And so, it's something I'm constantly evaluating with myself and reevaluating and, trying to find spots where I can just make calls that have nothing to do with the Leafs and ignore them for a day or two here or there. And, I think sometimes I'm doing it right and sometimes maybe not so well. But this is kind of the way my job evolved. This wasn't, it's funny, like to take you back, Peter, just as like for a way of history, because it kind of explains how this worked is, I first got hired at Sportsnet in January 2013. I was a younger reporter then, obviously. And, at that point, I'd really only done print work. I'd done some TV work, but not a ton. And the thinking behind my hiring was, this guy has promise, let's give him some TV work. And so initially where I found that TV work, as I said, we want to start to send you to every Leafs game and we'll let you, do hits at the intermissions of our broadcasts and you can write stories and do all those things. And so that's what I did. And then as I've gone along, eventually I got the hockey night gig. And, the focus of my job has become more national, but I've kept doing a lot of those other things. And so what I do day to day was never written up like this is the perfect, way to use an individual. It's just I've added sort of pieces to what's expected of me. I really enjoy what I do. I want to keep doing what I do. And so I do it to the best of my ability. But you're right. It can be a tough balancing act to be worried about a suspension happening in a game that happened at, in a late night from my time zone between LA and Arizona, say, and what's going on with the Leafs switching around their second line of practice that morning and all that kind of stuff, because I do a little bit of everything. But, I love the chaos of it. I kind of love that I don't ever feel like I live the same exact day again and again and again, like a lot of people that, work in an office or what have you.
Right.
So, that's kind of an explanation how I got here. And quite honestly, my contract's expiring with Sportsnet in the next couple months. And, I think it's possible as part of that. I mean, I don't know if they want me back yet, but if they do, it's possible my job changes again because, these things do tend to evolve over time.
How much did the circumstances of this year kind of add to it? Because a lot of it is kind of developing those relationships. Like you don't just, excuse me, you don't just get to Sportsnet and they say, and now you shall be an insider. Like you have to kind of develop those relationships to become that. How difficult was that this year?
It was the worst part of the job for me, honestly. It's just not being ever face to face with anybody, besides my wife, but like in a professional setting, being so distant, even the GMs or players that I talk to and text with, it's still nice to see them face to face every now and again. And, part of what I loved about the job and before times was, getting out to the other rinks and just bumping into scouts at the airport. And, there was a little bit more free flow of information. It was my personal experience, though, that guys were actually more reachable in some ways this season on their phones and stuff. I think that's because a lot of people weren't traveling, or if they were traveling, say, with their team, they weren't doing much in that city. They're just sitting in hotels when they weren't at games. I think everyone's life kind of slowed down in a sense during the pandemic. I know it's picking up now again in the US, but, it was still manageable. It was a lot less fun. I love being at the rink. I love being in the mix. I love being face to face and, trying to find stuff out. That's where I kind of get the juice for the job. And I like where I live here, but it's a small apartment in downtown Toronto and I didn't leave it too much this year. And it's hard to cover a whole league from here. But I do think my experience must mirror what everyone else kind of went through. It's not that different. But I do know I can't wait if we get back to a point where either we can go in the dressing rooms or we're in the media room before the game and you see people. And, there was actually a point during the first round, I went to Montreal for game 6 and I could watch the morning skate there at a different spot that we do in Toronto. And I actually saw Kyle Dubas and his assistant, Brandon Pridham, and we had a bit of a conversation from afar, not on, they weren't giving me scoops. We were just, BSing. But I was like, wow, I haven't actually seen these guys except through a Zoom camera for 18 months. It's a very unusual experience, and I hope not to have to live it again.
Right. A couple more for you. Just want to cover some non-Toronto teams. And after what we just talked about, remarkably unfair of me to do, but the Calgary Flames, that's the city I live in. It's where we first chatted on Calgary Sports Radio. I thought they were the most disappointing team in the National Hockey League this season, all due respect to expectations for Philadelphia or the Rangers. I thought the Flames missing the playoffs was not necessarily a part of my equation this year, and they did it rather handily. So what do you expect to see from the Calgary Flames this offseason?
It's weird. It sort of feels to me like it's been hanging over that organization for a year or two. It feels like they're in need of maybe a fundamental change. And I realize that's hard to do. If we're talking about the two guys that everyone focuses on, the trade Goodrow or Monahan, they're somewhat distressed assets in some of those years. I think certainly they've at least explored, the way lots of teams explore, never make trades to see what the market might be. And there's not been anything there, but it just feels like they've kind of taken it as far as they can with that group of players. And, I know a couple of years ago, they won the Western Conference, the top seed, and losing the first round to Colorado, which, may very well right now be, that was an ascendant team that might be about to win a Stanley Cup here in the next 6 weeks or so. I do think that they have to kind of go back a little bit to square one. I don't necessarily mean a full rebuild, tear down, but I think they have to consider, not just running it back. It's kind of, it's a little different in the Leaf situation because those players are older, right? And right. At some point their production levels are going to drop, and just because of aging curves, it's what happens everywhere. So you're going to have a plan to have more coming behind them, I think, to support them if they do end up staying. So, I don't know what this is going to look like. It seems Brad Treliving is going to remain the general manager for the time being. I didn't know if that would happen. It's hard to ignore that, Daryl Sutter being back behind the bench, and sort of the power he wields. He's not just any old head coach, right? Working right for any old organization. And so I do expect the personnel moves to be sort of more in his style of play. And I do think you have to make some fundamental changes there. So, I think it's going to be a big offseason in Calgary. It's just not yet clear to me who's moving on, what they're targeting. But status quo doesn't work. I'm with you in the disappointment. I actually picked them to win the North Division. I know predictions aren't worth the digital screen they're printed on, but I reached that conclusion because I looked at their offseason. I looked at a team I thought that just needed better goaltending, frankly, based on what they did in previous years. I like the Jacob Markstrom signing. I actually think Tanev worked out okay for them, relatively speaking. But they're definitely missing something, and I think they have to go find it.
Yeah, and it's a tricky time because I thought those big changes should have come last offseason, and then the entire world changes, and now there's all of a sudden substantially less cap space to make all of these changes, and you're kind of there's only a select number of teams that can just take on a $6 million contract and then to give up assets and stuff with that. It's just, I feel like the timing for the Flames, not that everyone was stoked the pandemic hit, but I thought the timing for the Flames specifically really, really sucked for them.
It did. And they have a decision on Matthew Tkachuk coming, right? I mean, he signed a short contract for a second deal. He's going to want long-term and big money on the third one. You can be sure that's kind of how it goes. And so, I think it's not just looking at him, the player. Do you think he's worth it? But I think they have to be reasonable about where they'll be at as an organization in those years. Do we want to be tying that money up in him? Is there some kind of rebuild, retool coming? I think that there's some big decisions to be made. And so we got to first know for sure who is the person making them, and then, go from there in terms of what those decisions look like. But, they're at a bit of a crossroads, in my opinion. And unfortunately, they didn't, 3 or 4 years back, anyone looking at that team, wow, that they've got something there, and it didn't quite pan out. I'm not even sure it's any one person's fault. It's a really hard league to win in. Yeah. But I do think they have to kind of rethink what the core of the team looks like moving forward, because I'm not sure you've seen enough now to know that these this particular grouping of players probably aren't just one more addition away from getting over the top.
And last one, Vancouver. They have a number of like franchise altering decisions to make this coming off season with basically any member of their core aside from Bo Horvat needing a contract. What type of an offseason do you see in Vancouver? I'm already 0 for 1 predicting there. I would have lost a whole lot of money thinking that Jim Benning wasn't coming back. So I'm already starting behind on the Canucks. How do you see this offseason going in Vancouver?
I don't see how it gets better. I mean, they're just because they're a team. Look, they just missed the playoffs also by a wide margin.
Right.
You know, their COVID situation can't have helped that. You know, I'm sympathetic to that. That was a difficult time for the organization. But, you know, really they're in a position where they're just trying to keep the guys they already had on the team that wasn't good enough. And I don't see a lot of room to add around those players. I think, you know, the benefit to them is that Elias Pettersson and Quinn Hughes are both still very young. Their more productive years are ahead of them. I would bet my house on that. And so you can expect them to get better and make even a bigger impact on the ice, but you're going to have to pay for that. You know, they've earned monster second contracts. I think, you know, it sounds like Pettersson is more likely to take a shorter bridge type of deal. I think Quinn Hughes, they've at least explored the idea of, you know, 5-6 year deals, you know, if not even longer than that. And so, you know, I think this offseason is really about signing those players and then doing absolutely anything you can beyond that to make the team better. But there's not a lot of cap space. They've tied up too much money in their bottom six in players that just aren't making a big enough impact to justify, you know, where they're at. I don't begrudge the players. You take the money you can get while you can get it. This is a brutal business, and someone will push them out the door as soon as they can. But you know, they need some big changes and don't have that much flexibility to do it. But the first thing you do is lock up those two players and go from there.
CJ, I've taken up way too much of your time, man. Thank you very much for this today. I really appreciate it. It scares me that you think you don't have the right balance of the work thing, because if you don't, I definitely don't. But thanks for this, and hopefully we'll chat soon.
I think it's a universal. I should be clear on that, Peter. Like, I remember my dad once said he felt like he was given too much to work. If he was given too much to work, it was never enough with the family. And if he was spending more of his energy on his family, he felt like he was leaving something on the table at work. So I think this is what it is to be human, and let's just all do our best.
Totally. All right. Thanks, man.
Thanks, bud.